إن أعجبك الفيديو لا تنسى الإعجاب والاشتراك في القناة.
In the world of academia, where ideas are written and disseminated by virtue of higher education, ultimately filtering down from certain key spots with key opinion leaders into the world around us, and ultimately into our churches and synagogues. In that academic world, there has been a wave for well over 100 years that challenges the validity and the authenticity of much of what we find in Scripture. In the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament is it's also called, we have seen in the last 2 decades a vigorous assault on the united monarchy. So that's King Saul, sort of, and David and Solomon before the kingdom split into the northern Israel and the southern Judah. But we've seen an assault on whether or not that existed in any way, shape, or form like is portrayed in the Bible. And one of the key archaeologists in Israel, named Israel Finkelstein, is one of the thought leaders who has written popular books, given popular interviews, been in popular journals like National Geographic, espousing the view that if there was a David, he was no regal king over an empire. He was rather akin to Pancho Villa, a bandit of sorts with a ragtag group of people. And you think, well, that's just, no, this is a major thought leader in this area. His views, in my opinion, were academically destroyed by the speaker that we're going to have tonight, who, through archaeology, has provided a better glimpse into the 10th century of Israel. So I'm excited to have him share with us what he's got to share. But there are a couple of words that you will need to know. He will pepper his language with place names that will sound totally foreign to you because he pronounces them properly. We pronounce them the way we do in Texas. Wait till you hear what he calls lake-ish. It's not even a lake. You will need to listen carefully to those names. You will also need to know terms like a minimalist, and that's someone who believes that the historical information in the Bible is at best minimally true. It's nothing that of any great accord. A maximalist or a textualist is someone who believes much more so in the authenticity and accuracy of the record that's given. I'm sure there will be other terms that he'll pepper with. Don't hesitate when you're writing your questions to write basic questions as well as questions that you may be intrigued by on a more significant level. Now, having said that, I want to introduce to you Professor Yossi Garfinkel. If you read about him, you'll see he's a professor of archaeology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, also head of the Institute of Archaeology. You'll see he's been a visiting scholar at Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. Join me in welcoming him.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I really need to thank Mark Lanier, which created this wonderful institution, this wonderful library, and a series of lectures, giving us an opportunity to share our knowledge with a large number of people. I also like to thank this wonderful the library staff that organized my tour and took me to the airport and back and forth. Some of them even participated in the excavations, so this is really wonderful. And anybody who wants to participate in the future is, of course, most welcome. So thank you for joining me this evening, and I will try to take you to a journey to a place which is very far away from Texas, but quite close to everybody's heart. And this is King David, one of the most famous figures in human history. Where are we? We are not in the United States of America. We are in the Near East. You can see here the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern part, Turkey in the north, Egypt in the south, and to the west, to the east, you have the Levant with Israel and modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. In antiquity, in a very small area, we have the Kingdom of Judah. This area, if you drive with a car from one side to the other, it will not take you more than 1 hour. And in the time of David, probably the entire population was maybe 5,000 people. So we are not talking here about a huge area. We are talking about a rather small area. But why it's so important? Just because of one reason. They wrote the Bible. They wrote the Old Testament. And David, what do we really know about David from historical point of view? And this is not just David, it's the whole story about the Kingdom of Judah, because he was the first king that established Jerusalem. And then the question is, since all we know is from the biblical tradition, or at least most of the knowledge, is this tradition accurate? And here came archaeology to help us. So what archaeology can contribute? And another question is, of course, the chronology. When David ruled. You can see here that it's written 1000 BC. But where is it written that Jesus was 1,000 years after David? So how do we know the date of David? In itself, it can be a whole lecture just about the chronology. But I will make it very short. The trick is to combine biblical chronology and Egyptian chronology. According to the biblical text, David ruled for 40 years, and then Solomon ruled for 40 years, and then in the time of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, in the 5th year, there was a campaign of an Egyptian pharaoh. In the Bible, his name is Shishak. Now we go to Egypt, and we're trying to see when this Shishak ruled, and when was the campaign to ancient Israel. And the date, more or less, is 925 BC. But nobody's sure exactly about this date, and some people would like to take it up even by 10 or 20 years. But if we take 925, plus 5 years of Rehoboam, plus 40 years of Solomon, plus 40 years of David, what do we get? 1010. So I should write here 1010 BC. But the point is that nobody knows exactly if 925 is 925. 40 years in the biblical tradition, it's mean one generation. So 40 can even be 42. But 40 can be 37 or 35 or who knows exactly. So 40 is a rounded number. That's why I also prefer a rounded number. David ruled at about 1000 BC. This is the best we can say. For thousands of years, the biblical tradition has been accepted as representing accurate historical data. You can see here some of the greatest scholars in biblical studies and archaeology and ancient history from the 20th century BC, Professor Albright, Professor Benjamin Mazar, Professor Yigael Yadin. All of them didn't accept the biblical tradition and that it says indeed accurate historical memories. But this has been changed about 40 years ago in a very severe way. And it happened first in Copenhagen in Denmark, and then in Sheffield in England, and then it spread all over, including Israel, Tel Aviv, for example. Even in Jerusalem, we have some scholars who are accepting these ideas, and all over the world. And this group is, you can see together, is called minimalist. What's the idea of the minimalist? They said we don't believe even in one word that's written in the Bible from historical point of view. And if we want to see, if we want to study anything about biblical history, we need to look at document outside of the Bible. So if something is documented in Egypt, it's okay. If something is documented in Mesopotamia or other place, it's okay. And then they will start looking at sources, historical sources out of the Bible. And who is mentioned first from the time of the kings? Ahab. Okay, King Ahab is mentioned for the first time by Shalmaneser III in the middle of the 9th century BC. So this is 150 years after David. So this is the beginning of historical sources, or this is the beginning of history in the Bible, the time of Ahab or his father, the Omri, so the Omrite dynasty in the middle of the 9th century BC. And what's about Judah? Judah is mentioned for the first time in Assyrian documents toward the end of the 8th century BC. This is almost 300 years after David. So this was the idea of the minimalist movement, and basically they said the earlier data about David and Solomon is all mythological. And that's why I called it here the mythological paradigm. Paradigm is a word concept. By the way, the minimalists themselves went in evolution, and there will be three phases and there are three phases in the development of the minimalist movement. The first one is the mythological. The second is chronological. I will explain what it is. And the third one is ethnic paradigm. So what is the mythological paradigm? You already know. The Bible was written hundreds of years later, and therefore David and Solomon, we have no scientific proof that they ever existed. So a united monarchy never existed. The kingdom of Israel was first, and Judah was much later. In 1990, David and Solomon, we have no scientific proof that they ever existed. So a united monarchy never existed. The kingdom of Israel was first, and Judah was much later. In 1993, this situation has been changed severely because of the excavation of Avraham Biran. You can see him here in this photograph. And Avraham Biran worked at Tel Dan for many years, about 20, 25 years altogether. And then in 1993, he discovered part of an inscription. You see the larger part. The two smaller parts were found a year later. Till today, we don't have the upper part and we don't have the lower part. We just have part of this inscription. And in this inscription, which is not even written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic. And there is an Aramaic king, probably Hazael of Damascus, and this king saying in this inscription, I killed 70 kings. I killed a king from Israel and a king from the house of David. And here we have House of David, which means Dynasty of David. So only since 1993, we have a scientific proof that David existed. So of course the mythological paradigm collapsed at this very moment. And 3 years later came the low chronology paradigm, which is basically Tel Dan bypass. Yeah, this paradigm is bypassed for the Tel Dan stela. And the idea is like this. Okay, there was David, but what was this David? He was just a Bedouin sheikh living in a tent, and in the period of David, there were no kingdom, no fortified cities, no urbanization, and no writing. And if you remember, according to the biblical tradition, we first have the time of the judges, and then we have the kings, which is already an urban society and state-organized society. So we have here a sociological process. We have a change from agrarian and tribal community into urban and state community. And the big question is when this process took place. If it took place 1000 BC, it's in the time of David. But if it took only 100 years later, or 200 years later, or 300 years later, it's not in the time of David. And the idea was that all this happened hundreds of years later. And here came the site of Khirbet Kayafa, which we started excavating in 2007, and we worked at the site for 7 years. You can see here an aerial photograph of the site. You can see the entire city surrounded by a city wall, and we excavated 2 gates and houses and some public buildings as well. But we have here 2 gates and 2 gate piazzas and a casemate city wall. I will explain what it is later. And also belt of houses connected with the casemate city wall. And we also have 2 public buildings at the excavations. Here you can see the western gate of Khirbet Kayafa. And this is what archaeology is calling a 4-chamber gate, because you can see that the gate has 4 small rooms. Each one of them is a chamber. Probably in this place, guards were standing and checking who is coming in and who is coming out. This is the second gate of Khirbet Kayafa, which is facing the south. And what do you see down there is the Valley of Elah. You remember biblical traditions about the Valley of Elah? We'll talk about it later. So the city has 2 gates. Here you can see a nice photograph of the fortifications. Now, how do you build a city wall? In antiquity, we have 2 ways to build city walls. One of them is to have a solid wall. The city wall can be 2 meters or 20 meters, but everything inside is filled with bricks or stones. So it's a solid wall. And the other way to build fortifications is to have casemate city wall. You have an outer wall, you have inner wall, and in between the space is left empty. And in this way you need less raw material, and then it's faster and also cheaper. And also, once you are circling an area with a city wall, every square feet inside is very valuable. And if you have rooms inside the city wall, you have more space that people can use inside the city. So this building technique has a lot of advantages. And it became popular in the time of the king, in the period of the kings, in the biblical period. We don't have it in Canaanite side, and it's something that has been developed in the time of the kings of Israel and Judah. This is our best preserved casemate, withstanding for more than 2 meters. So we have a wonderful preservation at the site. This site was suddenly destroyed. It was built, and after 20 or 30 years, it has been destroyed. How do we know that it lasted only 20 or 30 years? You know, when people living in the same place for a long time, they're changing one room, they're adding a balcony, they're building new wall, they're changing installation, and so on and so forth. In Khirbet Kayafa, we have only one phase. We have a floor, and that's it. Nowhere we have a wall on top of a wall, installation of top of an installation, or anything like this. So you really see that the city existed a very short time. I don't want to say 5 years, because I don't know how long, but it didn't last more than 1 generation. And it was suddenly destroyed. When it was destroyed, it was a horrible catastrophe to the people who lived there. But from archaeological point of view, it's a gold mine, because everything that was left at the city has been buried and remain to be excavated. And in this respect, Khirbet Kayafa is a biblical Pompeii. You know the story of Pompeii, where it was suddenly destroyed by a volcano and everything was frozen inside. So something very similar happened at Khirbet Kayafa. And the site is extremely rich with pottery, 100,000 pieces of pottery. We have a lot of metal objects, and usually we don't find many metal objects in excavations because they are recycled. If you have a pottery vessel that was broken, you can do nothing with the pottery shards. So they are left, and they are found in very large quantities in the excavations. But metal objects are recycled, so usually you don't find them. And we were quite lucky to have about 100 objects made from bronze and from iron, and even 2 small pieces of gold were found at the site of Khirbet Kayafa. We also have few inscriptions. I will talk about them later. And here on top you can see a special type of pottery. It is not locally pottery like most of the pottery of the site, but it was exported from Philistia, which is nearby. And then the big question is, of course, what is the dating of this city? And we sent olive pits for radiocarbon dating to Oxford University. First we have 4 or 5 olive pits, then 10, and then even now we have about 30 samples that were sent for radiocarbon dating. And look at the big surprise. Where are all these olive pits? Dated Some of them are a bit before 1000 BC, and then some of them are a bit after 1000 BC. So what is the indication here? That we have a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David. Once we have the radiocarbon dating, first results, we have a full page in the New York Times, and then National Geographic magazine, and then BBC, CNN, and all the and all the media in the world kept on writing about Khirbet Kayafa, season after season. And when I asked, and people were asking me, who making such wonderful PR for you? And I said, King David. So just look now at the minimalist strategies. In the early 1980s, we have the mythological paradigm that has been suggested, but it has been collapsed thanks to the Tel Dan inscription, which mentioned House of David. Then came low chronology paradigm, but it has been destroyed by the Khirbet Kayafa dating, because nobody can argue anymore that urbanism started in the area of Judah at the 7th century or the 8th century, because it started at 1000 BC. And then only 10 days after we published our first results, there was already an article in an internet journal which claims that Khirbet Kayafa is a Philistine site. You know, we are on the border between Philistia and Judah, so who knows who lived in the site? And so some people suggested that the site is or one scholar suggested it's a Philistine site. 4 years later, he wrote an article that this is a Canaanite site. And a few years later, he said that Khirbet Kayafa is so complicated, we should stop writing articles about it. And other people suggested that it's a site built by Saul, belonged to the kingdom of Israel. Israel is okay, but not David. And we think that the site is Judean. And now you see why I call the third phase ethnographic paradigm, because this is today the big question. All the debates today are not about mythology, are not about chronology anymore. All the discussions today is about the ethnic identifications of Khirbet Kayafa population. This is today the big question. As you can understand, all this was just the introduction to my lecture. And now I will start the lecture itself. And the lecture is Khirbet Kayafa a Judean city? This is the question, this is the debate. I have many arguments, and I will present here only 6, because otherwise I had to talk till midnight, if I'll present all the arguments and all the data we have. So there are 6 arguments. And what is the methodology? The methodology is like this. We're taking each one of them, which I will explain in a moment, and we compare it. We're doing here comparative analysis. We take the urban planning, we're taking the cooking habits, we're taking the evidence of administration, we're taking the evidence about writing, the evidence of the geopolitical location of the site, and then evidence for cult, and we compare it. What is the cult in Philistine sites? What is the cult in Canaanite site? What is the cult or the urban planning or each one of them in site in the kingdom of Israel? And what are the evidence in Judah? And as I will show you, and there's many archaeologists here, so I cannot bluff you because you don't know archaeology. Every word that I'm saying, there are 20 people at least that know better than me. So I will compare each one of these aspects to the other cultures around and Judah, and then we'll see if Khirbet Kayafa is more Canaanite or more Philistine or more Judean or more Israelite. Okay, you understand the method. It's very important that you understand the scientific method, how we are working. So the urban planning, as I already mentioned before, and let's move here. We have a casemate city wall. You see the city wall, very massive and big stones. Some of the stones are up to 8 tons. So you need a lot of engineering knowledge, how to quarry such stones, how to move them, and how to build with them. And then we have the private houses. And you see the small walls, the walls which are much thinner. These are the private houses. Now you can see that the person or the people or the family that live in room 1 could use the nearby casemate because you have a doorway leading into the casemate. And then if the people who lived in room 2 can use the nearby casemate, and the people who lived in room 3 can use the nearby casemate. And altogether around the site, there are about 100 casemates. How do we know this, by the way? Each casemate is about 6 or 7 meters, and the entire periphery of the city is about 700 meters. So there were about 100 casemates around the city. Where else do we have such urban planning, where we have casemate city wall and houses abutting each other? We have today 5 examples like this. We have them in Tel El Natzbe, we have it in Tel Bet Mirsim, we have it in Be'er Sheva, we also have it in Bet Kayafa, of course, and in Bet Shemesh. And now in Gezer you have something similar. So maybe we have 6 sites by now. Anyhow, all these sites that I mentioned, Tel Natzbe is north of Jerusalem, and Be'er Sheva and the other side, all of them are in the territory of Judah. We don't have any site like this in the coastal plain where we have the Philistine, in Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gat. We don't have it in sight of the Kingdom of Israel, and we don't have it in any Canaanite site. In the Kingdom of Israel, sometimes they use casemate city walls. Just to remind you, this is a casemate city wall, but in Israel it was well organized. There was order. You have the city wall, then you have a street, and then you have the houses. But when you combine the houses and the city wall together, it's raising a question. What is the casemate? It's private or public? Because on the one hand, the fortification is something public, but the private people can use it. So public and private are mixed together. And it's not very good when public and private are mixed together. So Judah was like Israel today, mess. Okay, the cooking habits. We discovered in the site thousands, even 10,000s of animal bones. And when they were analyzed, we see that we have a sheep, goat, and cattle. Even one pig bone was not found at the Iron Age city of Bet Kayafa. When you go to Philistine site like Ekron and Ashdod and Ashkelon and Gat, up to 20% of the animal bones are pigs. Okay, so the Philistine consume pork, and the Israelite and the Judean didn't consume pork at all. If you go to Canaanite site like Lachish, about 4-5% of the animal bones in late bronze Lachish, Canaanite Lachish, are pig bones. So again, you see that Bet Kayafa cannot be Philistine and cannot be Canaanite. Another aspect is how you cook your bread, pita bread. You see this pottery vessel, it's a shallow bowl. You put it on fire, and then you put the dew on top of it. You see all the holes? They have air inside them, which prevent the bread to stuck into the plate. So this is called baking tray. And in Bet Kayafa, in every building, we discovered few of them. You don't find them in Philistine sites at all. Okay, the next aspect will be administration. You see these handles which has a finger impression on them. Over 600 of them have been found at Bet Kayafa. What are they really? You can see here, we have jars, a large number of jars. This is just a small example, but hundreds of jars were found at the site. Most of them has 2 handles, but some of them has 4 handles. And on many of the handles, you have a finger impression. Sometimes on one handle, sometimes on 2 handles. Sometimes on one handle, you have 2 finger impressions, sometimes even 3. So there's some information encoded in these handles. This is very typical in the Kingdom of Judah to have jars with stamped handles. Number 1 here is what we call الملك jars, and they are typical to the 8th century BC. Number 2, you see the rosette, like a flower. They called rosette impression by archaeologists, and they are typical to the 7th century and early 6th century BC. You see number 3, you have a lion impression. They are typical to the end of the 6th century and early 5th century BC. And number 4 is what we call Yehud impression. You don't have a decoration, just an inscription. They are typical to the Achamaean period when Israel was under Persian rule. And number 5, I don't have a good picture, but it's a star, and you have letters, Jerusalem, around it. Now, what are these things? First of all, from our point of view, even if we don't understand what it is, the habit of impressing jar handles is not known in Canaanite site, is not known in Philistine site, and is not known in site in the Kingdom of Israel. So it's typical Judean concept. The question now is how to explain it. So let's go back here. How do you pay tax today? Nobody likes to pay tax, I assume. So how do we pay tax? When you have a salary, the government immediately takes 20-30% of it, okay? But this is possible to do today when we have money. But what's happened in antiquity? Coins were invented only 400 years later. So how in the Canaanite period and also in the time of the kings of Israel and Judah, how the population paid tax to the kingdom? There were 2 ways. One is to donate time. People had to donate every year few weeks to participate in public works, like building fortifications, organize road, participating in military activities, or harvest the king land. And the other way is to give part of the agricultural products. If you grow lintel, you give lintel. If you grow barley, you can give barley. If you grow olives, you can give olive oil. You can take from people only what they have. Now, how the kingdom collecting all these agricultural products? You need to collect them. You need to transport them into central storage houses. And then you had to redistribute them as salaries to officials and priests and other people which are part of the kingdom administration. So to do all this, you need containers. So the kingdom developed this system of marking the jar, marking the containers, in order probably to prevent corruption. Because how you control the system? If you go to somebody's house and you find in the house a jar with a finger impression, the person had to explain what the jar doing at his home. And also it's easy to collect them when they are empty and to recycle them. So when you mark the jar with a finger impression, or Melek impression, or rosette impression, or lion impression, or any type of impression, then you know that this jar is a royal jar, and it's part of the administration. And we can see that this habit starting at Judah already at 1000 BC. Writing. Before our excavation at Khibet Kayafa, even one inscription was not known in the 10th century BC in this area. And indeed, people claim that there was no knowledge of reading and writing in Judah, so it was not possible to document historical knowledge. And when the Bible was written in the Persian or Hellenistic period, nobody knew what happened hundreds of years earlier. And that was a great excitement when this inscription was found already in the 2nd season of excavation in 2008. We have here 70 letters organized in 5 rows. It started with Al Ta'as. You see the first letter like capital A in English at the far edge. I can talk just about the inscription forever. I will not do it to you tonight, don't worry. But we discovered the first inscription. And a few seasons later, this is the second inscription. This is a jar, and here the letters are incised on the jar. You can see again the A, capital A, on the top. And here we have a name, Ishbaal, Ishbaal, men of Baal. And this is Baal is also Ben, son, and the father is Beda. So what we have here is Ishbaal, son of Beda. Beda is a unique name. It was never found in any, it's not mentioned in the Bible, and it was never found in any other inscription. So it's a new name. Ishbaal, on the other hand, is well known. There are 5 people called Ishbaal in the biblical tradition, all of them from the time of David. But you know, Baal is also the name of a Canaanite god, and the biblical author didn't like it very much. So in some cases, they censorship and then change Baal to Boshet. It's almost the same letters, but Boshet means shame. So instead of being men of Baal, you became men of shame. So that's what happened to, for example, to the son of Saul. You remember that Saul was killed in the Gilboa, and after him, his son that ruled after him for 2 years was called Ishbaal. But in Samuel, he's called Ishboshet. And in Chronicle, the original name has been preserved, and the same person is called Ishbaal in Chronicle. And we have a few other examples of people that their name has been censored and changed. But here we can see the original way of Ishbaal. Now, can you imagine that we will find a jar, Ishbaal, son of Saul? It will become a royal jar, or a royal name. But fortunately enough, it didn't happen to us, because if it would happen, nobody will believe it and said it's a forgery. It will be too good to be true. So I'm very happy with the Beda as the father. When we published it, it reached the newspaper all over the world, and we were invited to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with the jar. We want to see the jar. So here we are in front of Prime Minister. But can you imagine, we were noticed only 2 hours ahead that he wanted to see us. So that's why I'm with the jeans, just caught me in the middle of Jerusalem, and we didn't have even time to have something more decent. At least the Yanir Library gave me a few months' notice. Okay. And this was a great opportunity, because there were plans to build neighborhoods all the way up to the site. And once we have this meeting with Prime Minister, I have a chance to tell him about the site and the situation, and to convince him that the area around the site should become a national park and not a neighborhood. And indeed, we managed to cancel 1,300 apartments. Think about the huge damage that the Ishbaal caused to Israeli economy. But let's go back to our topic here, and these are the 2 inscriptions. Where else do we have inscription in this period? After we published our Khirbet Kayafa Ostrakon, 2 years later, this here, what you see above, is a similar, another inscription was published from the site of Bet Shemesh, which is nearby Khirbet Kayafa. And another year or two, another inscription was published from Jerusalem. Okay, so now we have, before Khirbet Kayafa, we didn't have even one inscription from the early 10th century with this. I even didn't mention, but this script is not even Hebrew. It's called Proto-Canaanite or Canaanite script. So there were no inscription at all, and suddenly in 5-6 years, we have 4 inscriptions. Where are they? Jerusalem is, of course, in Judah. Khirbet Kayafa is in Judah. Bet Shemesh is near Khirbet Kayafa. So all these inscriptions are in the territory of Judah. They were not found in Canaanite side, Philistine side, or in the kingdom of Israel. And this is very logical, because once you have a kingdom, what is a kingdom? A kingdom is not something abstract. A kingdom is an organization where you send orders from the center all over, and then you get report from the periphery to the center. And when you have these things of much more correspondence, the tribal community, you need many more people who know how to read and write. And this is reflected in the appearance of 4 inscriptions in the area of Judah and not in any other part of the country. Now, the geopolitical importance of Khirbet Kayafa, as I showed you before, it's overlooking the Valley of Elah. The Valley of Elah here is the border between Philistia and Judah, and the Valley of Elah is also the main road leading from the coastal plain, from the port of Ashdod and the port of Ashkelon into Jerusalem. So it's really a very strategic point. But this point is not important if you are Canaanite, and it's not important if you are part of the kingdom of Israel, and it has no meaning if you are a Philistine. So this is really something that's very important only if you are in the hill country in Judah. So it's not surprising that the battle between David and Goliath is located exactly where Khirbet Kayafa is. As you remember, the battle is in the valley of Elah between Socho and Azekah. Azekah is 1 mile to the east, Socho is 1 mile to the east, and Azekah is about 1 mile to the west. And Khirbet Kayafa is exactly between Socho and Azekah. And here we have a very severe question. What is the relationship of the site and the story and the tradition? We have a tradition about this specific location, and exactly in the same place, we also have this fortified city, which was destroyed after a short period. I think it's quite clear. This area was a battle area between the Judean and the Philistine for generations. The Battle of David took place in this location. The heavily fortified city of Khirbet Kayafa was built in this location, and then the city has been destroyed because of this location. Okay, and the last aspect here is about the cult of Khirbet Kayafa. Again, I can talk about it forever, but I will not do it. We'll do it very shortly. We excavated about 10 houses and 60 rooms. So we have a very large horizontal exposure of the city and the various rooms. We have a very good sample. In 3 of the rooms, we have cultic paraphernalia. We discovered cultic objects like shrine models that you see over there, like libation vessels, altar made from basalt, and other objects. These special objects are not spread all over. They are concentrating in these 3 specific rooms. What is interesting for us is what has not been found in Khirbet Kayafa. And we did not find this type of clay figurines, pottery figurines. These figurines are known already from the early Neolithic period, from almost 10,000, from as early as 10,000 years ago, and even earlier. And what are these really? Usually you can see that they are representing a naked woman, usually with the breast, sometimes the hands emphasizing the breast, and it's very clear that this is about fertility. The one in the middle, for example, has twins in her hand. Now, if you think about the fertility cycle, when a woman is pregnant, she can have miscarriage. When you have the delivery, it's very dangerous. Even today, some women can die during delivery. And then you need milk to feed the baby. And we are talking here in antiquity without hospitals and without proper medication like today. So it was a very, very hectic situation. And probably women which were in the right age kept at home 1 or 2 figurines like this, which will help them during the process. So it's very, very common. And when you go to Philistine site, you find them. If you go to Canaanite site, you find them. If you go to a site in the northern kingdom of Israel, like Megiddo, Chatzor, Ta'anach, and other sites, you find them. Where we don't have them, we don't have them at Khirbet Kayafa from the 10th century BC. We don't find them in other sites in Judah in the 10th and 9th century BC. You will not find them in Arad, Beersheba in earlier levels. What is interesting is that when you go to Jerusalem in the 8th and 7th century, this is already 300 years and 400 years after Kayafa, you find 2,000 of them in Jerusalem. And this is probably why the prophets are talking against idols, because originally the cult was without idols. And then Judah, when it became bigger and richer, also accepted and foreign influence like figurines, and they came in. But in the beginning part, in the first 200 years, you don't find them in Judean sites. So again, if you look at the cult, you can see that Khirbet Kayafa is different than Philistine, Canaanite, or Israelite. Another thing that we found in our excavation are 2 shrine models. These are boxes which were used to keep God's symbols. And what happened is that this one is of great interest because it has all kinds of motifs on it, architectural motifs, like near the roof, you can see the beams of the roof organized 3 together. This is called triglyphs. And if you look at the doorway, you can see that you have 3 recesses around, 3 frames around the entrance. This is what we call recess entrance. And when we read the biblical text about Solomon Palace and Solomon Temple, you can see that the same aspects are presented in the biblical text. This was not clear because the way these things are presented, the Hebrew name is tzlaot, which means ribs. And the lintels are called mashkufim, shkufim. And the sides are called mezuzah. And this term, mezuzah, was distorted a bit and became mechzeh. I will not go here into linguistic analysis, it's too complicated. Anyhow, this is the way that we are understanding the facade of Solomon Temple based on the biblical text after we analyzed it in according to the Khirbet Kayafa shrine model, building model. And here you can see how we are reconstructing the temple with windows and with, you see the beams of near the roof that penetrated a bit. These are the tzlaot. These tzlaot are mentioned not only in the description of Solomon Temple, but also Prophet Ezekiel, when he described the temple, he said, and the ribs, rib to rib, three together. והצלעות, צלע אל צלע שלוש. I know it's too complicated, but what I want to show you here, that Khirbet Kayafa, indicating that the biblical tradition about Solomon Palace and Temple is not something mythological. We have description of royal architecture at the text in the 10th century BC, and in the archaeology of Judah in the 10th century BC, we have representation of the same architectural motifs. And again, it's not in Judah, it's not in Israel, it's not in Philistia, and not in Canaanite sites. So I can summarize this part of my lecture. Why is Khirbet Kayafa a Judean city? And you can, and as I show you, we have a typical Judean urban planning. We have no pig bones, and we have baking tray for the cooking habit. We have stamped jar handles, which is a typical aspect of Judean administration. We have inscription. It's number 4, and we also have 4 inscriptions, so it's nice to see here. The geopolitical location in the valley of Elah, and then the cult, which we have no graven images, and we also have these architectural models which are similar to the textual description of royal architecture in Jerusalem. And all this is summarized in the book which was just published in June in Europe and in July in the States, which called In the Footsteps of King David. It was written by 3 people, myself, Yosef Garfinkel, but also by Sar Ganor and Michael Hazel. And this is the time to thank them. Sar Ganor is my student. He discovered the site. He brought me to the site. And when I was there, I was deeply impressed, and we decided to excavate. And we have, together, we were the directors for a number of seasons. And then Michael Hazel from Southern Adventist University in Chattanooga, Tennessee, joined the project. So we are presenting here the results of our excavation. And this is a popular book for the general public. We also have a more scientific book. There is one copy of it in the Lanier Library. I even signed it 2 days ago, or yesterday, I think it was yesterday. Anyhow, it's called Debating Khirbet Kayafa. And here we are really using scientific language and arguing about various aspects. Some of them I didn't even mention in the lecture. But this will really, if somebody wants to know, to be updated with what's going on in Khirbet Kayafa on the scientific level, this is the book. And if you want to know more or less, the first book that I mentioned will give you the relevant information. But now let's say that I convince you that Khirbet Kayafa is indeed a Judean city. Are you happy? I'm not happy. You know why? It's not enough. One city is enough. The whole kingdom of David is one site. I don't think it's good enough. So what shall we do? We should find a second site. And then people in the future will find the third site and the fourth site, okay? And here again, Sar Ganor make miracle. He find another site from the time of King David. This time it was easy, because when we start Khirbet Kayafa, we didn't know if the site will be from any time. I mean, it was a very impressive site, but it could be from the time of Hezekiah, it could be from the time of any king. We didn't know when we started. But after we excavate Khirbet Kayafa and we have the pottery, we knew how the pottery from the time of David looked like. Okay, so we have now a very nice assemblage. And any site that will have pottery like this can be dated to the time of David, to the 10th century BC. And when this site, which is called Khirbet Arai, which means the ruins of the shepherd, Arai is Roe in Arabic, so Khirbet Arai, it's an Arabic name. Also Khirbet Kayafa is an Arabic name. And this site is located near Lachish. So Sarganor found the make a survey in this region of Khirbet Arai. He make a larger survey, but on this site, on the surface, he found pottery like Khirbet Kayafa. So of course we couldn't resist it, and we started a project here. And we excavated in a number of areas. And in area B, we found evidence for activities from the time of King David. Now this site is not a big and nice city like Khirbet Kayafa, it's a village. So now we can write a book as a city and a village from the time of David, okay? What is again very special is the location of the site. Like Khirbet Kayafa, which is sitting on the border between Philistia and Judah and on a main road, which is the valley of Elah, this site is located between Judah and Philistia, but on the Lachish Valley, opposite Ashkelon. So it's a main route leading from Ashkelon to Hebron. And Lachish is just in the middle, and Khirbet Arai is 3 kilometers further toward the border. So you see here a very similar photo like you saw in Khirbet Kayafa looking the valley of Elah, and this Khirbet Arai looking at the Lachish Valley. And the best preserved part from the time of David are these 4 rooms. I cannot show you a whole city. 4 rooms, 1, 2, 3, and 4. These rooms were suddenly destroyed, and we produced enormous amount of pottery. Just for room 3, there's about 70 or 80 complete vessels. So it was really a storage room. And we also have, we discovered seeds that were sent to for dating to Oxford University, the same laboratories that analyze Khirbet Kayafa, and we have the same date, about 1000 BC. So we have the same pottery and the same date, which is a wonderful thing. And we, okay, here you can see one of the rooms. Look at the massive stones, very impressive architecture. This is part of the destruction. You see complete vessels, which is a blessing because you don't need to spend money on restoration. Don't think that it's that simple. You know, the jars that I show you, every jar needs 5 days. 3 days to like a puzzle to find all the pieces, 1 day to glue, another day where you have some part missing to put plaster instead. And the cost is about $1,000 for 1 jar. So if you want to restore 20 jars or 30 jars, think how much it costs. So when you have complete vessels, we are very happy. Here you can see some of the, this is only half of room 3. I told you that there was enormous amount of pottery. In one season we excavated half. These are the results of the restoration from one half. And now the other half of the same room has been excavated, and they are continuing the restoration of the other room. So if I summarize now, and this is really the end of my lecture, what now all this excavation can tell us about the historical King David? One, that we have urbanization and not just villages. 2, we have pre-planned cities. Because the map of the site was distorted, I couldn't talk about it, but think about, you have Kesmet city wall and houses, and they're abutting each other. You cannot build a house here, a house there, and suddenly the city wall will be connected to the houses. So everything was planned before they put the first stone. They already knew how the city going to look like. And where are the 2 sites are located? On the border and on where you have a main road. So we can talk about fortified, defined borders. One against Gath, one against Ashkelon. We have administration, the jars with the finger impressions. We have evidence for writing, just in this region, again, because we have a beginning of a kingdom and you need all these administration and writing to control the area and the population. And we also have a new cult, which is different from the cult of the nearby cultures. And I emphasize the location of the two sides, Khirbet Arai opposite Gat, Khirbet El Rai opposite Ashkelon, and what can be better than finish with David lament over Saul. Tell it not in Gat, publish it not in the street of Ashkelon. Okay, there are 5 Philistine sites. Ashdod is far away, Ekron is far away, Gaza is far away. So David relating to the two cities which are closest to Judah. Thank you.
As I recall, when you and your excavation were first making the media, there was media write-ups that were also thinking perhaps Caiaphas was the biblical city, Sha'arayim, which is the dual form of the Hebrew for 2 gates, because you had found a 2-gated city, which was rather rare, and there's a reference to that in the David story. Do you believe that Sha'arayim, the biblical Sha'arayim, is what we now call Caiaphas?
Sure, I mean, we wrote it, we suggested it. It was not somebody else's suggestion. I didn't talk about it because I cannot talk about everything in the lecture. But of course, every site that we are excavating, the question was what was the biblical name of the site? You can ask me the same question about Arai, but I will not tell you, because we just wrote an article about it and we sent it for publication. So if you want to know what is the biblical name of Khirbet Arai, you have to invite me again. Anyhow, a city called Sha'arayim mentioned 3 times in the biblical tradition. 2 of the times it's associated with the valley of Elah, and 2 of the times it's associated with King David. And our site, Khirbet Caiaphas, is located in the valley of Elah and is from the time of King David. So this in itself is enough to suggest that Khirbet Caiaphas is biblical Sha'arayim. But on top of this, we have the name. What is the meaning of Sha'arayim? Sha'arayim means 2 gates. Now, most of the sites that we have in Israel or that have been excavated has only 1 gate, because the gate is the weakest part of the fortification. You have a city wall built from mud or from mud brick or from stones, and what is the gate? Only wood. You have a wooden door. So you can set it in fire, you can take it out of its hinge. It's very easy to break into the city through the gate. Okay? So usually cities were built only with 1 gate. And Khirbet Caiaphas is built with 2 gates. And the name of the city, Sha'arayim, indicates 2 gates, which is an exceptional situation. So we're taking this as a third argument, but not the only one. And then came an Israeli scholar and said that in biblical names, sometimes we have dual, also for cities which has, or places which is only 1, like Bachanaim, which means 2 camps, or Ramatayim, which will mean 2 Ramot, 2 high places, or 2 high areas, but there's only 1. So people said Sha'arayim can be a name also of a city with 1 gate. So it's not a proof that Khirbet Caiaphas is biblical Sha'arayim. But then I'm saying if a city with 1 gate can be called Sha'arayim, a city with 2 gates cannot be called Sha'arayim. Okay, it cannot.
Okay, next, what does the name Khirbet Caiaphas mean?
Believe it or not, it's not very clear, and it has even been suggested that the Caiaphas family came from Khirbet Caiaphas, which will even make it part of the New Testament, not just the Old Testament. But this is, of course, not possible. Khirbet Caiaphas is an Arabic name, and it can be maybe a beautiful place, like Kef, Caiaphas, is a beautiful place. And another interpretation that has been suggested, that Cape is also mean rock in Arabic, and it might be the ruins, Khirbe mean ruins, so it's the place of the rocks. And why? Because of the valley of Elah, which create white cliffs in this region. So maybe it means the area of the white cliffs, or the area of the cliffs. But we don't really know exactly what's the meaning.
not surprised we got this question. I'm only surprised that it's only here once or twice. What does the inscription say, and what language was it in?
Oh, I don't know even where to start. You know, in the ancient Near East, the first writing methods have been developed in Mesopotamia and Egypt. In Mesopotamia, we have the cuneiform tablet, and in Egypt, you have hieroglyphs. These are very, very complicated and sophisticated writing methods, and in order to write, you need to study hundreds and hundreds of different signs till you are able to use this script. And then the Canaanite came at about 1,800 BC. This is already 800 years before Hirbet Kayafa. And they invented the alphabet. This is probably one of the most important intellectual achievements, that you have a very simple method of reading and writing, which enable everybody today to read and write. And our inscriptions are written in this type of Canaanite script. They are not even Hebrew or Phoenician. So they are very, very early in the evolution of writing. And in this stage of writing, there was no standardization. When you write, you can write from left to right, from right to left, and even boustrophodon, which means as the ox plow the field, one row like this, one row like this, one row like this, one row like this. And our epigraphist, when he tried to decipher the inscription, he tried all possibilities, to read it from left to right, and then from right to left, and then boustrophodon. And then in the end, it turned out that the best reading is from left to right each time. And the part that we have, as you may notice, we are at the edge of the pottery shirt, so maybe it's broken and one or two lines are missing. It's also a possibility. But the beginning started with al ta'as, which means don't do. Wonderful letter. Maybe a wife sent to her husband, don't do. Anyhow, what is important here is the word ta'as, if it's indeed ta'as. Because in Phoenician and Canaanite, they will use another verb. They will use pa'al. And only in Hebrew you use the word ta'as. The word to do in Hebrew is different than Canaanite or Phoenician. And that's how it's turned out, or it has been suggested that this inscription is the earliest alphabet inscription ever found. By the way, all these four inscriptions are all written in this Proto-Canaanite script. And only in 50 years from this moment, it will be changed to what we call Phoenician script.
Wonderful. How tall would the fortified walls have been?
It's hard to know, because usually we have only the foundations or just the lower part. But when you see Canaanite cities or Israelite cities in Assyrian or in Egyptian document, you can see the height of a person, and then you can see the height of the city. And so we can estimate that the city were maybe 6 meters or 7 meters. And then the gate area is always higher, taller. So the gate could be even a few meters higher than the city wall. Because the gate, as I told you, is the most venerated part of the city. So they fortified it much strongly, so it will be harder to get close to it.
So 20 to 25 feet for the walls. Okay, the casemate walls, you've got that section between the outer wall and the inner wall, which was also a wall into the home. Mm-hmm. What would cover that?
This will be the top of the city wall. I think that the lower part was used for the family, but then you have the roof. And what was the roof really? It was a kind of road that encircled the whole city. And if an enemy coming from here, soldier can run quickly on top of the city wall and run to wherever is needed.
Do you find evidence of the city wall having crumbled into the casemate? Is that part of what you were having to dig out, or?
Yeah, what happens that when the city came out of use, things collapsed. So the roof and the upper part of the houses, everything collapsed in. So all the side, all the houses and all the casemate were covered with stones. Yeah.
Did you find any timber or anything else you were able to date other than the olive pits?
We didn't find timber, and the city was not burnt. And I think that what's happened here is that when you have an Egyptian army or Assyrian armies that came and conquered the city, and they are marching from hundreds of kilometers, they came to destroy. So they put everything in fire and then everything is lost in the city. But if it's just fighting between neighbors, Gat and Caiaphas are only 8 miles away. When the Philistines probably conquered Caiaphas, what did they do? They dismantled all the wood and took it. They robbed everything that was possible to rob and take it home. What is all the fun about war if not to loot your neighbor?
Is the site currently protected from poachers? Poachers being looters,
Illegal.
thieves,
Not really.
Oklahomans. That's a joke.
I didn't mention, but on top of the Iron Age city, we also have a level from the Hellenistic and Persian period, late Persian and Hellenistic period. When we excavated it, we have a metal detective go over the site, and we have about 600 coins uncovered at Khirbet Caiaphas. Many of them are silver coins from the Persian period. They are very rare. Some of the specimens that we have never found before in other excavations. We also discovered large tetradrachma coins of Alexander the Great. So Khirbet Caiaphas is the only site that David and Alexander met, probably. But why I'm telling you all this? Because people in Israel who collect coins like to go with metal detective in archaeological site, and when it's buzz, they dig and take the coins. And when you visit Khirbet Caiaphas, many times that I visited the site, I see these small holes which were dug by people who are looting coins.
Which brings up the next question. Describe how sites like this are found or identified.
Well, we have there was very systematic surveys in Israel. Already the British make a huge surveys in the middle or in the 1870s or in the 1870s it has been published. So this was the first people that really make systematic archaeological surveys and looking for archaeological remains. And since then, other people make a lot of surveys. In the Shfela region, there was a guy called Yehuda Dagan that worked for 20 years and surveyed and documented thousands of sites.
The Shfela region are the foothills?
Yeah. The Shfela, in Israel you have the coastal plain, the Shfela, the hills area, and then the mountains. Jerusalem and Hebron are on the mountains. And the big question is when the Judean king spread from the mountain into the lowland.
Okay. So how did your student discover this site?
This site, by the way, is mentioned already in 1850. This is 160 years before we start excavating by a French traveler. His name was Victor Guérin. He was probably a French spy that came to see what's happening in the Ottoman Empire, because he wrote this information only after 20 years. But he was the first one to mention Khirbet Caiaphas. I'm not even sure that he visited the place, because he said, I visited Bet Natif, a large village nearby, and then he said, on the other hill, there is a place called Khirbet Caiaphas. So did he visit the place, or didn't visit the place? I don't know, but he's the first one to mention it.
How many archaeological sites are there in Israel today?
Altogether, it's about 30,000 archaeological sites.
30,000. How many of them have been excavated?
Maybe 1,000.
1,000 of the 30,000 have been excavated. And when we say excavated, you did a thorough excavation, but a lot of these, you only excavate a very little bit, right?
It depends on time and funding and manpower, how many volunteers arriving. So if you want us to have large horizontal exposure, you should come as a volunteers and participate in the dig.
Do you have, somebody said, how do we? So if people would like to participate in a dig, how do they go about doing that?
You know the journal Biblical Archaeology Review?
Yes.
And the Biblical Archaeology Society. In their website in January, they're publishing all the excavations that are happening in Israel and Jordan. Usually every year there are 30 or 40 different excavations, and you can choose which one you like according to the period, according to the ancient period, but also according to the time. If it's better for you to come in June or